Sheriff George Corwin added another stone to the pile, 40 pounds of rock, then 60, then 80. The old man beneath them, 80 years old, stripped naked, a wooden board crushing his chest, was asked again to enter his plea. His answer? More weight. Those two words would become the most famous last words in early American history. But what makes them extraordinary isn't the defiance. It's that Giles Corey knew exactly what refusing to speak would cost him, and he calculated that 2 days of being slowly crushed to death was worth it. This wasn't a man breaking under torture. This was a man using torture as a weapon against his torturers. September 1692, Salem, Massachusetts. The witch trials had already claimed 19 lives by hanging. Over 100 people sat in prison cells awaiting trial, and the special court set up to handle these cases, the court of Oyer and Terminer, had a perfect conviction rate. Every single person who pleaded not guilty had been found guilty. Every one. Giles Corey understood something that would take the rest of Salem months to figure out. This court wasn't interested in justice. It was a machine designed to produce convictions, and he decided he would rather die than let that machine use him. What happened over the next 48 hours would help bring the entire Salem witch trial to a crashing halt. To understand why an 80-year-old farmer chose to be crushed to death, you need to understand the man himself. And here's where the story gets complicated, because Giles Corey was not a good person. He was baptised on August 16, 1611 in England, which made him roughly 80 years old in 1692. He'd emigrated to Massachusetts and built himself into a prosperous farmer in Salem Farms, what's now West Peabody. He owned extensive landholdings. He'd married 3 times. By colonial standards, he was wealthy. But his neighbours would have used different words to describe him. Contentious, litigious, quarrelsome. Contemporary records describe him as leading a scandalous life, the kind of man who seemed to enjoy conflict. And then there was Jacob Goodale. In 1675, 17 years before the witch trials, Giles Corey beat a farm worker named Jacob Goodale to death. Not in a sudden rage. He struck him with a stick approximately 100 times. Goodale didn't die immediately. Corey actually sent him to get medical attention afterward. But a few days later, Goodale was dead. Corey was charged with murder. But here's how colonial justice worked. Corporal punishment against servants was legal. The court convicted him only of using unreasonable force and made him pay a fine. So when we talk about Giles Corey's heroic death, we need to hold both truths at once. This was a man who had beaten another man to death and faced minimal consequences. And this was also a man who would choose to die under torture rather than participate in an unjust system. People are complicated. History is complicated. The same person can be a murderer and a martyr. Now, while Giles was building his reputation as Salem's most difficult neighbour, something else was happening in his household. In 1690, he married his 3rd wife, a woman named Martha Pannon. Martha was different. She had a son named Benoni from a previous relationship, a biracial child which would have marked her as unusual in colonial Massachusetts. But more importantly, Martha was devout, genuinely, deeply religious. She was admitted to the Salem Village Church in 1691, and unlike her contentious husband, she was respected in the community. She was also skeptical. When the witch trial accusations began spreading through Salem in early 1692, Martha Corey didn't join the panic. She publicly criticised the trials. She refused to believe that witches were actually among them. This skepticism would cost her everything. On March 19th, 1692, Martha Corey was arrested for witchcraft. And here's where the story takes its darkest turn, because when Martha was arrested, her own husband testified against her. Giles Corey stood before the magistrates and claimed that Martha had bewitched him, that she'd bewitched his farm animals, that strange things had been happening since she'd started questioning the trials. We don't know exactly why he did this. Fear, self-preservation, the same contentious nature that had defined his entire life? Whatever the reason, Giles Corey betrayed his wife to the very court that would later kill them both. But within weeks, something changed. Giles tried to take back his testimony. He attempted to recant what he'd said about Martha. In colonial Massachusetts, this was disastrous. Recanting testimony wasn't seen as correcting a mistake, it was seen as perjury. And perjury carried severe social and spiritual consequences. Worse, the court interpreted his recantation as evidence of something sinister. Why would a man suddenly change his story about witchcraft unless he himself was under the devil's influence? On April 18th, 1692, exactly 1 month after his wife's arrest, Giles Corey was formally accused of witchcraft. The accusations against Giles came from the same group of afflicted girls who'd been at the centre of every Salem accusation. Ann Putnam Jr. claimed that on April 13th, Corey's spectre, his invisible spirit, had visited her and demanded she sign the Devil's Book. She also reported something even more dramatic. A ghostly figure had appeared to her and announced that it had been murdered by Corey and that Corey had made a covenant with Satan. Remember Jacob Goodale, the man Corey had beaten to death 17 years earlier? Ann Putnam was now claiming his ghost was appearing to accuse Corey of his murder and of witchcraft. Mercy Lewis, another accuser, testified that Corey's spectre had beaten her so severely she feared her back would break. This was the evidence: invisible spirits, spectral visits, dreams and visions that no one else could see or verify. To understand why this evidence was enough to arrest and try someone, you need to understand how the court of Oyer and Terminer operated. Governor William Phips had established this special court in June 1692, specifically to handle the flood of witchcraft accusations. Chief Justice William Stoughton, a true believer in the reality of witchcraft, ran the proceedings. And Stoughton had implemented a revolutionary rule. He allowed spectral evidence. Spectral evidence meant that if someone testified that your invisible spirit had appeared to them and harmed them, that testimony could be used to convict you. The theological problem was obvious. Could the devil take on the shape of an innocent person? If he could, then spectral evidence proved nothing. The accused might be completely innocent while the devil used their image. Theologians had debated this for centuries, but Stoughton overruled the objections. In his court, spectral evidence was admissible. Think about what this meant for defendants. How do you prove that your invisible spirit didn't visit someone in a dream? How do you demonstrate that you weren't flying through the night tormenting your neighbours? The evidence was, by definition, impossible to refute. But Stoughton had added another twist. Confession meant survival. Those who admitted to witchcraft were spared execution. Those who maintained their innocence were hanged. The system was perfectly designed to produce convictions, confess and live, deny and die. And spectral evidence made conviction virtually certain for anyone who went to trial. By September 1692, the results were clear. 19 people had been hanged, 14 women and 5 men. 5 more had died in prison. Over 150 people had been formally accused. More than 100 sat in prison cells awaiting trial, and the court of Oyer and Terminer's conviction rate remained perfect, 100%. Every defendant who entered a not guilty plea was found guilty. Giles Corey had watched this happen. He'd seen his neighbours tried and convicted on spectral evidence. He'd watched the hangings. He understood, perhaps better than anyone, that walking into that courtroom and saying not guilty was a death sentence. But there was something worse than death, and Giles Corey had figured out what it was. When Giles Corey appeared before the court of Oyer and Terminer on September 16th, 1692, the magistrates expected a straightforward proceeding. The accused would plead not guilty. The afflicted girls would perform their theatrical testimony. The jury would convict. Another witch would hang. But when the clerk asked Giles Corey how he pleaded to the charges of witchcraft, Corey did something no Salem defendant had done before. He said nothing. The clerk asked again, guilty or not guilty? Silence. The magistrates demanded he enter his plea. They explained the charges. They reminded him of the consequences. Giles Corey stood mute. This wasn't confusion. This wasn't an old man too frightened to speak. This was a calculated legal strategy. Under English common law, which governed the Massachusetts colony, a defendant who was convicted of a felony would forfeit all property to the Crown. Everything. Land, money, possessions. A legal process called attainder would strip the convicted person's family of their entire inheritance. Giles Corey owned extensive farmland in Salem. If he entered a plea, went to trial, and was convicted, which seemed certain, his entire estate would be seized. His sons-in-law would inherit nothing. His family would be left with nothing. But here was the loophole. If Corey never entered a plea, he technically never became a defendant in the legal system. The trial couldn't proceed. And if he died without ever being convicted, his property would pass to his heirs exactly as he'd planned. Before his arrest, Corey had already taken precautions. He'd written a will transferring his Salem Farms property to his sons-in-law William Cleves and John Moulton. But a will could be challenged if he was convicted of a capital crime. By refusing to plead, he ensured the conviction would never happen. Some historians argue that property protection was Corey's primary motive. It certainly played a role. But there's evidence that something else was driving him. He'd already transferred his property through the will. The legal protection of standing mute was almost redundant. More importantly, Giles Corey had watched what was happening in that courtroom. He'd seen innocent neighbours convicted on impossible evidence. He understood that the trial was theatre. The verdict was predetermined the moment accusations were made. As historian Chadwick Hansen argued, Corey's death was a protest against the methods of the court, rather than merely an economic calculation. By refusing to plead, Giles Corey was saying something profound. I will not grant this court the authority of my consent. I will not participate in this farce. I will not legitimise your process by going through the motions of a trial whose outcome is already decided. It was an act of civil disobedience, an 80-year-old farmer standing before the most powerful court in Massachusetts and refusing to acknowledge its authority over him. The magistrates were furious, but they had a tool for exactly this situation. When a defendant refused to enter a plea, English law prescribed a specific remedy. It was called peine forte dure, French for hard and forceful punishment. The procedure had been codified in English law since 1275. The intent was coercion. Apply pressure, literal, physical pressure, until the prisoner agreed to enter a plea and submit to trial. Here's how it worked. The prisoner would be stripped naked and laid flat on the ground, face up. A wooden board would be placed horizontally across their chest. Then, one by one, heavy stones would be added to the board. After each stone, the prisoner would be asked to enter their plea. The weight would continue increasing until one of two things happened. The prisoner agreed to plead, or the prisoner died. Pressing to death with heavy weights had been added to the punishment in 1406. By the late 1600s, it was rarely used even in England. The last English case would occur in 1741. It was considered barbaric, a relic of medieval justice. Giles Corey's pressing was the only use of peine forte dure in the history of the American colonies, before or since. On September 18, 1692, Sheriff George Corwin led Giles Corey to an open field beside the Salem jail. This wasn't hidden away in a dungeon. It happened in the open where townspeople could witness. Magistrates were present. Captain Gardner of Nantucket, a man who had known Corey personally, was there, trying to convince him to enter his plea. A man named Robert Califf watched the entire proceeding and would later provide the most detailed account of what happened. Corey was stripped of his clothing. He was laid face up in a shallow pit that had been dug in the field. A heavy wooden board was placed across his chest, and then the stones began. One by one, heavy boulders were carried to the pit and placed on the board. After each stone, Sheriff Corwin and the magistrates would ask the same question. Will you enter your plea? 40 pounds of stone. Will you plead? 60 pounds. Will you plead? 80 pounds. Guilty or not guilty? The process continued, through the afternoon, through the night, through the next morning. Most torture victims cry out. They beg. They bargain. Giles Corey maintained an almost unnatural silence. Judge Samuel Sewall, one of the magistrates who would later publicly apologise for his role in the trials, documented what happened. Much pains was used with him 2 days, one after another, by the court and Captain Gardner of Nantucket who had been of his acquaintance, but all in vain. 2 days. For 2 days they added weight and demanded he speak. For 2 days Giles Corey refused. The human body is not designed to withstand hundreds of pounds of direct pressure on the chest. As the weight accumulated, Corey's ribcage began to compress. Breathing became impossible except in shallow gasps. The pressure on his internal organs was immense. Sleep was not an option. To lose consciousness under that weight meant instant asphyxiation. But the most graphic detail comes from Robert Califf's eyewitness account. At some point during the pressing, the weight became so great that Giles Corey's tongue was forced out of his mouth. Sheriff Corwin, standing over the dying man, used his cane to push the tongue back in. Think about that image for a moment. An 80-year-old man, naked, being crushed to death in an open field. his body failing under hundreds of pounds of stone, his tongue protruding from the pressure, and the sheriff, the man responsible for this torture, casually pushing it back into his mouth with a stick. This is what the Salem witch trials looked like up close. Not abstract accusations and courtroom drama. This. After 2 days of this, on September 19, 1692, the magistrates made their final demand. 3 times they asked Giles Corey to enter his plea. His response became the most famous last words in early American history. More weight. Not a plea for mercy, not a confession, not even a denial. More weight. Those 2 words have been interpreted in many ways. Some see them as a practical request. If he was going to die anyway, more weight would end the suffering faster, an acceleration of his own death. Others see them as pure defiance. Even as he died, Corey refused to give the magistrates what they wanted. He wouldn't plead, he wouldn't break, he would demand they add to his torture rather than submit. But maybe it was both. Maybe Giles Corey understood that every additional stone was a statement. Every pound of weight added to his chest was proof of the court's cruelty. Every moment he survived without speaking was a testimony against the injustice of the entire system. More weight. Keep going. Show everyone watching what you're willing to do to an old man who refuses to participate in your theatre. At approximately noon on September 19th, 1692, after roughly 2 days under the stones, Giles Corey died. He had never entered a plea. He had never been convicted. In the eyes of the law, he remained innocent, and his property would pass to his heirs exactly as he'd planned. The Salem village church didn't wait for Corey to die before passing judgment. On September 18th, the day the pressing began before his death, the church voted to excommunicate him. The charge wasn't witchcraft, it was suicide. The church determined that Corey's refusal to plead and his acceptance of death constituted a form of self-murder. Judge Jonathan Corwin ordered that Corey be buried in an unmarked grave on Gallows Hill. No proper Christian burial, no headstone, his body was disposed of like refuse. 3 days later, on September 22nd, 1692, Giles's wife Martha was hanged. She was one of 8 people executed that day, the final mass execution of the Salem witch trials. Among the others were Mary Easty, Alice Parker, Mary Parker, Anne Pudiator, Wilmot Redd, Margaret Scott, and Samuel Wardwell. Reverend Nicholas Noyes, watching the 8 bodies swing from the gallows, called out, "What a sad thing it is to see 8 firebrands of hell hanging there." Within months he would understand how wrong he was. Giles Corey's death didn't end the trials immediately, but it accelerated something that had been building for weeks, a growing unease about what Salem had become. The problem was accusation creep. In the early months of 1692, the accused had been marginal figures, servants, the poor, people already on the fringes of society, easy targets. But as the trials continued, the accusations reached further. Respected citizens, church members, wealthy landowners, and then, most shockingly, someone accused Governor Phipps's own wife of witchcraft. Phipps reacted exactly as you'd expect a man with power to react when the system he'd created threatened his family. He intervened immediately. But Corey's death had also shifted something in the community's psychology. This wasn't a distant hanging glimpsed from far away. This was 2 days of public torture. An old man being slowly crushed to death in an open field, refusing to speak, demanding more weight. The brutality was visible, undeniable. Meanwhile, the intellectual case against spectral evidence was building. Cotton Mather and his father, Increase Mather, 2 of the most influential religious voices in Massachusetts, began publicly questioning the court's methods. In October 1692, Increase Mather published Cases of Conscience Concerning Evil Spirits, arguing directly that the devil may appear in the shape of an innocent person. If the devil could impersonate innocence, then spectral evidence proved nothing. And if spectral evidence proved nothing, then every conviction based on it was suspect. In October 1692, Governor Phipps dissolved the court of Oyer and Terminer. A new court, the Superior Court of Judicature, was established in January 1693. This court prohibited spectral evidence. Without spectral evidence, the trials collapsed. The remaining accused were acquitted or released. By May 1693, Governor Phipps issued a general pardon to everyone still imprisoned on witchcraft charges. The Salem witch trials were over. 19 people had been hanged, 1 had been pressed to death, At least 5 had died in prison, over 100 had been imprisoned, and the entire thing had lasted less than a year. There's one more piece to the Giles Corey story, though this part ventures into legend rather than documented history. According to Salem folklore, as Corey died under the stones, he shouted at Sheriff George Corwin, "I curse you and Salem!" The most reliable historical sources, Robert Calef's eyewitness account, record only more weight as his final words. The curse may be later folklore, stories that grew around the tragedy in the years that followed, but what happened to Sheriff Corwin is documented fact. George Corwin died on April 12, 1696, just 4 years after overseeing Giles Corey's execution. He was 30 years old. The cause was a heart attack. He died still in debt to a widow named Mary English, whose property he had illegally seized during the trials. There were even rumours that English's family threatened to steal Corwin's corpse unless the debts were repaid, forcing the Corwin family to bury him secretly in their own basement rather than the family crypt. Over the following centuries, Salem residents noted a strange pattern. Multiple sheriffs of Salem died, or were forced to retire due to cardiac complications. The pattern allegedly continued until 1991, when the sheriff's office was relocated out of Salem. In 1914, a massive fire destroyed a third of Salem, starting on Gallows Hill. Locals attributed it to Corey's curse, claiming his ghost had been seen shortly before the flames began. Is any of this real? Almost certainly not. Curses aren't real. The pattern of sheriff deaths is likely coincidence and selective memory. The fire had mundane causes, but the persistence of the legend tells us something. Salem needed a way to understand its own history, the horror of what had happened, the guilt of what the community had done. Giles Corey's curse became the narrative through which that guilt found expression. The idea that the town was cursed for what it did to him. In a sense, they were right. The curse was real, it just wasn't supernatural. It was the weight of historical memory, the knowledge of what ordinary people had done to their neighbours in the name of justice. The Massachusetts colony did eventually confront what it had done. In 1697, the Massachusetts General Court declared a day of fasting and repentance for the trials. In 1702, the courts issued a formal written apology. In 1711, the Massachusetts legislature formally cleared Giles Corey's name, declaring the trials unjust. Restitution was paid to the families of those who had been executed. Judge Samuel Sewell, one of the magistrates who had overseen the trials, did something remarkable. He issued a formal public apology and spent the rest of his life doing penance for his role. Every year, on the anniversary of the executions, he would fast and pray for forgiveness. It wasn't enough. Nothing could be enough. But it was acknowledgement. Giles Corey would become famous again in 1953, when Arthur Miller put him in The Crucible. Miller described Corey as 83, knotted with muscle, canny, inquisitive, and still powerful. In the play, Corey becomes a symbol of individual integrity against institutional tyranny. Miller used the word weight 10 times throughout the play, making it central to the theme, the weight of truth against the pressure to conform. When John Proctor, the play's protagonist, hears of Corey's death and learns that he demanded more weight, Proctor repeats those words, understanding their meaning. Miller was writing during McCarthyism, when another kind of witch hunt was destroying lives through accusations that were impossible to refute. The parallel was obvious, and Giles Corey, the contentious old farmer who refused to participate in an unjust system, became a symbol of resistance. Here's what makes Giles Corey's story so uncomfortable and so important. He was not a hero. He beat a man to death and faced only a fine. He testified against his own wife when the accusations began. He was quarrelsome, litigious, difficult. His neighbours didn't like him, and yet, in his final days, he did something genuinely heroic. He recognised that the court was corrupt, that participation meant legitimising injustice, that the only moral choice was refusal, even unto death. People contain multitudes. The same man who killed Jacob Goodale was the same man who died under the stones rather than submit to a corrupt court. Both things are true. This is what makes history complicated. We want our heroes pure and our villains obvious. Reality doesn't work that way. Giles Corey was a deeply flawed man who made a profoundly courageous choice. His flaws don't erase his courage doesn't erase his flaws. The Salem witch trials lasted less than a year. In that time, they demonstrated how quickly a legal system can descend into tyranny, when a few conditions are met, evidence that cannot be verified or refuted, incentives that reward confession and punish truth-telling, fear that overrides judgment, authority that refuses to question itself. Every conviction in Salem was based on spectral evidence, testimony about invisible spirits that no one else could see. The accused had no way to prove their innocence because the evidence against them was, by definition, impossible to disprove, and the system rewarded confession. Admit to being a witch, and you lived. Maintain your innocence, and you died. Over 50 people confessed to witchcraft during the trials, not because they were witches, but because confession was the only path to survival. Giles Corey understood something that the confessors didn't. Survival wasn't the only value worth preserving. Sometimes refusing to participate in injustice matters more than living through it. On September 19th, 1692, in an open field beside the Salem jail, an 80-year-old man was asked one final time to enter his plea. He had been lying beneath hundreds of pounds of stone for 2 days. His ribs were broken, his organs were failing, his tongue had been pressed from his mouth. The magistrates needed one word from him, just one word, guilty or not guilty, and the torture would end. He could enter the legal system, receive his predetermined conviction, and be hanged like all the others. He said 2 words instead, more weight, and then he died. The only person in American colonial history executed by pressing. A man who chose to be crushed to death rather than grant legitimacy to a court he knew was corrupt. Within weeks, the trials would collapse. Within months, the accused would be released. Within years, the convictions would be overturned and apologies issued. Giles Corey didn't live to see any of it, but his refusal, his absolute unbreakable refusal to participate, helped make it happen. More weight, that's what he said. That's what he chose. And 300 years later, we're still talking about it.